Uh, friends, I think we should start now. We are already 9 minutes behind, and people will come as they come, but the panel is here. I have the privilege of chairing this first session. We've been allotted 60 minutes in all, and without any ado, we'll go straight into the first round of presentations. This simple egg timer will give exactly 3 minutes to each speaker for their first remarks. After that, we'll have about 20 minutes of conversation in the panel where they will talk, maybe respond to a few questions that I might put. And then we'll open the session to the floor. Now, when we open it to the floor, with the presumed permission of the panel, only people who are under 35 will first get a chance to speak. How many are under 35? No? Okay, whoever. So in the first round, probably there'll be no time for a second round. But in the first round, only those under 35 may speak, please. Because young people are always shy, always feel that they must defer to their seniors. Well, I believe that we should really defer to the juniors, because they are the future, not we. Certainly not anybody of my age. Therefore, I hope you will indulge me in this, and we will then have a final round of responses from the panel. And at the very end, I'll sum up things literally in 2 minutes. There's also a 2-minute timer. I'll use the 2-minute timer for myself. Okay, so thank you very much. We first begin with Professor Srimati Chakravarthi. No introductions because all the material is in your pack. Please, the timer is on now.
Thank you. I'll speak just a few sentences about my personal association with ICS, as well as how I saw it evolve. It was as a student that I came to know of ICS in the mid-1970s, but it was then not called the Institute of Chinese Studies. It was called the China Study Group. That group comprised of mainly my teachers, Professor Mohanty, Professor Deshinkar, Professor Meerasena Bhattacharya, and others. And once in a while, they would organize seminars. Of course, there were never big events, but modest events, but very useful ones, and I used to attend them. And of course, the weekly seminar, then not known as the Wednesday seminar, used to be held. Now, in the 80s, I found that apart from weekly seminars, whenever anything important happened in China, a proper national conference of sorts was held. Like after the fifth NPC, I remember there was a conference and I was asked to read a paper. And of course, things were then held in the premises of the CSDS, Center for the Study of Developing Societies, because China Study Group was part of that. And of course, the journal China Report was coming out regularly. There was also a small library, which we as students sometimes used. Now, in the 90s, when the MEA came forward with support, the CSG became the Institute of Chinese Studies, but was still a program of the CSDS. However, for some years, when renovation was taking place of the CSDS premises, ICS had moved to the Indian Law Institute, but activities continued. In the later period, a solid grant from Ford Foundation helped in expanding many activities like international seminars, publications, field trip grants to China, then young scholars workshops. At that time, Professor Patricia Oberoi was, in charge. And, that Ford Foundation grant really helped ICS to grow. It was in 2006 that the first China Studies Conference was held in Delhi University to take stock of the state of Chinese studies in India, and it was from 2009 that it became an annual event. In the last decade, with massive grant first from the Ministry of External Affairs and then from Tata Trust, ICS has grown
40 seconds.
In leaps and bounds, and we have, now everything is there for everybody to see. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fantastic. I think you've actually saved time. You saved about 15 seconds. The timer still has a little bit of juice left in it. So I have to wait until it runs out. The next speaker, who's the next speaker? Manu? Oh, Patricia? It's Patricia? Okay. Patricia, your time starts.
Okay, well, the strictest chairperson on this earth. What China Studies is about is something that we have been debating ever since we began. That's a 50-year discourse, changing in various ways. Not only us, it's all over the world and through actually centuries. If you like to put it that way, since I would say in the subcontinent, the founding of the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784. Now, but recently Madhavi Tampi has set up a project in ICS to look at recent developments. She has said more than once that though we keep on discussing this, we're getting repetitive. And now is the time for taking stock of very fast-moving events. So what was true earlier is not necessarily true. Now, I would like to say that we shouldn't go back over history, but you can always learn something from history. And I probably won't be able to say anything much about it, but to my mind, the essence of where I want to look for inspiration in history is in the learned societies of the late 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, which do not perform the same role at the present time. Now, Mao was famous for his list of contradictions and ongoing dilemmas. I have just a few contradictions to put on the table. The first is language versus discipline. Do we engage in language studies? Do we have to have a discipline? The trouble is you need both to do a good job. And the trouble with that is, within our infrastructural constraint and administrative constraints, how can we do it? Second one is between Chinese exceptionalism and a comparative perspective. Indians should be at an advantage in this, but one fails too often to see it in practice. I once said of the dissertations I have examined that people write about China without looking out their own windows. The third is whether we want to conform to and be reckoned in terms of the standards and themes and interests of global discourse in China studies, or we have the ambition, as was put on the stage this morning, to have an Indian perspective. If so, what is that? And then the opposite is that is an Indian perspective necessarily to be determined by or restricted to national interest in its narrow senses? I had more to say about the lessons from the learned societies. If there's any time at the end, I'll say it. My four
The sand has run out. Thank you. Thank you very much. You know, if you've known somebody for 57 years, they'll say anything about you and you have to keep quiet. Manu, you have the floor. Yeah.
Okay. My time starts now. First of all, I bring greetings from Tanchung. Tanchung, 90-year-old, one of the founding members of the China Study Group in 1969, whom I happened to meet in two conferences during the last 1 month, one in Chaling in Hunan province, and another time last week in Futan University, China-India Dialogue. Well, I will just make one point, which is about my interest and frustration and hope. That's how to create a genuinely global base for knowledge. For that reason, I had chosen to study China in addition to India, because European history and its colonial view of the world had shaped all knowledge. And my frustration is, even though some of us have tried to do and create new basis of knowledge, new concepts, new formulations, and so on. But still, during the last 30 years, there has been a reversal. Today, globality is highly contested. And once again, European culture, European information system, and European development strategy has won. And Indian and Chinese elites have adopted it as their motto. Therefore, contested globality once again puts me back to 50 years ago. How we recreate this effort to have a new global base at a time when all parts of the earth have people who are conscious of their dignity, their culture, their ability to contribute and relate with each other. So that's where China studies has to be relocated today. And I thought Jindal Global University, what I heard today during my first trip, even though I have terrible discomfort in the term governance because it has replaced politics, which defines my existence. And last 30 years, all the new universities have dispensed with the term politics. They have opted for governance. So I urge that new China scholars are really new global scholars, creating a new global base for knowledge. Thank you.
Fantastic. Absolutely. You know, Manu, you prove how in 2.5 minutes you can say so much. Really, outstanding. Our last speaker on the panel is young Dr. Anand. Since he's the youngest, he gets 3.25 minutes.
I think I'll finish with you. Thank you, Ambassador Rana. So, since time is short, let me get to a topic which I have been thinking for the last one and a half, in fact, 2 years now. And this is my belief. I mean, it might be contrary to popular opinion, that I think it's time that we delink policy from studies. And we do China studies devoid of policy. I mean, in a sense, I'm coming it from a research point of view, because both policy and studies, in my belief, have not fed into each other. I mean, what was initially intended that both will have a dialogue has not necessarily happened. In fact, the overbearance of policy has ensured that even on questions and research topics and themes, we have started to approach or adopt a policy-based approach, and which necessarily may not be in depth in long term, and also in terms of gaining a critical mass, it might not have achieved its intended results. In fact, let me also go on to say that the way in which we deal with China, especially on questions of China, inevitably seem to come with this notion of implications for India or learning from China. And in fact, I consider a lot of them as tropes, and also which, in fact, going back to an article written by Professor Oberoi a few years ago, which could also be sensed as ad hocism and routinization, which in fact was very helpful with your pieces. So what we intend to look in terms of short, crisp fixes for socio-political and economic issues that are on table in both with regard to studying China, I think policy falls short. And I think it's a time that we have a real critical look of delinking policy and academic studies. I think this also gives me a segue into my next topic, which I wanted to put up in the opening conversation. The overbearance of policy also comes with the fact that, I mean, a lot of time it is also due to paucity of resources, to get funding, all these difficult questions, you generally have to adhere to the policy route. But I think this also has, I mean, it comes at various costs, but I think it's also time that we take a serious look on this. And in fact, this is another of my favorite topic on how essential in China studies or even any other discipline, how we could make a start. And I think the start could come from just the student-teacher relationship. And that is extremely critical in terms of China studies, I have found in my own experiences over the years. Because the essential link on studying China in this country for a long time has also remained the teacher-student relationship as the essential building block. Given the inequities which in the Indian society in terms of class, caste, gender, region, the teacher-student relationship becomes extremely critical. And I think there leads to be a great lead of learning and unlearning that needs to happen. So I think I leave it there. Maybe in our discussions we can
Great.
further about this.
Thank you very much. Let me put a question that arose from the remarks of Patricia and Manu, and put it first to Professor Chakravarthi and then to Anand, but all of you can jump in. What is an Indian perspective that we can develop on China studies? Manu said globalization is out, Western perspectives dominate. Patricia also spoke about the notion of exceptionalism for China, which seems to underline much of the analysis. How do we develop an Indian perspective?
Well, my, off-the-cuff answer is that I think we have to take a civilizational perspective, because we have coexisted for millennia together. And in addition to that, there are other features which, bring commonalities between our two countries. For instance, both are primarily agrarian societies. Both have struggled with colonialism, okay? Then both have similar aspirations. So all these things together, can bring about an Indian perspective.
Anand, what do you think? How do you give an Indian perspective?
I think the Indian perspective can only emerge from the political socio-economic context within India. I mean, and how then you view China. So, for example, let me just put this question of anybody dealing with the issue of caste in India. I mean, generally, if you start to look at a comparative in China, definitely China doesn't have something called caste. But then you can explore it from the question of social justice and how social justice has worked, or the politics of it, or the social aspects of it have worked both in China and India. How have the liberation struggle in China, for example, has dealt with the question of social justice, and how the Indian experience itself has moved on social justice. And also maybe there have been comparative studies, in fact, being done with regard to Ambedkar and Mao. So maybe that
Thank you.
This is just one example.
Let's go back to a point that Patricia brought up. Manu, how would you make the bridge between language and discipline? Because it is a tragedy that only in India you can do a PhD without studying a language of the region you are studying. It may be Arabic, Russian, or Chinese.
I think the two experiments have failed, the DU experiment and the JNU experiment, which have created language experts or studies experts who don't know language or haven't used language. I think from the undergraduate level, language has to be made compulsory for those who want to, or at least it should be open as one of the subjects. We tried that. Actually, in the 70s, Delhi University introduced that, but it was not continued. In JNU, the two schools have no interaction, School of International Studies and School of Language and Culture. Only after you pass, some of them come to do PhD in, so that's one. But the other is, I think, today at the high school level, many foreign languages ought to be taught. I know in Springdale's Russian was being taught once upon a time. And I think we should have Russian, Chinese, French, German at the high school level as an option. Then at the undergraduate level. But we must make a capacity to use Chinese language materials as a precondition for doing research in China.
It may shock people here perhaps who don't know, but in more than 1,000 schools in India today, German is being taught. Why? Because the Germans are very clever at marketing their language. And frankly, I've served in Germany. Germany is not all that important at the end of the day. I would say French is far more important in terms of global reach. But Chinese, we don't see that. What do you say, Patricia?
perspective
things
I
are
would like to come back.
changing. Like the beginning of the China Studies Group and the programs in the universities, a lot of it was done actually by foreign agencies. It was the Ford Foundation which really supported China Studies in India. And now the language component of the mature studies is being supported by our Harvard Yenjing scholarship, by the governments of Taiwan, by the government of China, and not at home, which is where it should be. I'm also very surprised that Indians are so great with languages, and yet they take language learning, they're not very keen on language learning. As my problem, of course, personally was the opposite, that we had too much of language, and all of us in my class, in a proper Oriental Studies department, were always felt we never had a discipline. And that discipline also goes for understanding literature. You don't just do it off the back of your hand or anything like that. And we had to have, they said no one could do China Studies without doing Japanese, because the Japanese are the best writers on China and have the best resources, and their Kanbun texts are much better for reading classical Chinese. We had to have 2 European languages. They said you could have French, German, or Russian. Otherwise, we couldn't get our degrees in Oriental studies, in China Studies. Imagine that.
Great. Okay, now that we've thrown up a number of ideas, can I request the panel each to pick up one idea which you think deserves emphasis? We start with you, Srimati.
Yeah, actually, we, in practice, we did something in Delhi University to bridge the gap between language and studies. We introduced an MA East Asian Studies program where it was compulsory for students to do 2 years of language along with studies. Okay, that has helped a great deal. It works to a great extent, yeah. And in Jamia Millia, I know, the studies department has introduced language, and also Sikkim University, their language department is introducing studies. So these are some of the some small baby steps which have been initiated, and let's hope that works some way or the other.
Anand's counterintuitive and not very sensible point that policy has to be delinked from studies. You have to have a broader vision, in my opinion. And when I was looking at what killed the learned societies of the 19th century, which were the crucible of Europeans, the learning in European science and the new science, human science and social sciences, 3 things happened. One is professionalization. You get degrees, you have curricula, they're very ancient usually, you pass exams. Governmentality, where governments take over the role, like I was looking at anthropology, so the census of India, the reports on the peoples of India and that sort of thing, generating their own data, but without reference to disciplinary concerns. And the final one was this methodological nationalism, which is now the key term, where I really agree that if you have to judge everything by its relevance to national policy and pleasing those who formulate national policy, you will not be original. That should not be one's only aim.
Thank you. Patricia, that last point, some would question it.
Yeah.
To say that it should be linked with India is one thing. Nationalism is another thing altogether.
Yes,
and
yes.
the link is not an obligatory one, if I may say.
That is true. And I was beginning this, in fact, Indians have not been very good at understanding other countries. And we've often asked, why is that so? The anthropologists ask it. They say, anthropology is about studying other peoples. Yes. But in India, they only study themselves. That is not the whole idea. You use yourself, or you use your learning on yourself with reference to yourself.
As a point of
in
reference.
order to understand others. So you can understand more about the government today, perhaps, if you go to the Trobriand Islands and look at what the natives are doing, how they work within a segmentary society.
Great point. Great
Right.
point. Manu, you had a big point to make.
No, I want to get back to the Indian perspective. Actually, it should be Indian perspectives. Partly, an Indian perspective narrowly constructed is what serves the current policy. I think that is the opposite of an intellectual, honest intellectual task. You know, the great thing about the China study group in the 70s particularly was that this was a group of independent scholars who risked all kinds of opposition from the government and their university administrations to study and write on India-China border, studying cultural evolution and both for and against and various dimensions, reinterpreting the Chinese Revolution, reinterpreting the linkage between Indian history and Chinese history, Tan Chung's critique of Sinocentrism, our effort to link Indian freedom struggle and Chinese revolutionary movement. So if any one legacy is to be inherited from this group's 50 years of work is that rise against the tide, that whatever is the mobilizational current may not be the carrier of truth. And therefore multiple perspectives. Just to conclude, and the Indian self-perception, which is individual, group, every individual has to have his, her perception, is that the plurality, the contentions that are great traditions of this country, this civilization,
Great.
the freedom struggle, and the plurality that Indian democracy today is, and how we globally and in our study of China see this plurality. I think that is the range of Indian perspectives.
I think what you add is also ask awkward questions.
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly.
And I think you should also say on behalf of ICS that there was no single ICS view.
Exactly.
And I hope there never will be.
Okay.
Exactly.
We're never to be branded, we're like this, we're
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that, we're like the other.
Yeah.
The thing about those old days were the terrible arguments.
debates.
The terrible arguments. And then we'd all say, all right,
Okay,
but we've had
great,
to say.
great. Anand, you are the last speaker in this round. After the floor has spoken, the panel will each get a minute. So this is not the last you heard from them. Anand, any point?
No, I think I would like to reiterate, I mean, the fact that I'm not saying that you don't look at policy studies at all, but I think this, there's always a sense of immediacy. I mean, the fact that you have to respond immediately China does or anything related to China. I think that, in a way, stymies what we really are looking for. I mean, that kind of an in-depth, critical mass kind of a work is something stymied by policy. And that is what I emphasize when I'm emphatically arguing that we do policies, but I think let us de-link policy and studies and then do it separately. Yeah.
Excellent. I mean, you are exemplary, Anand, in how you organize your thoughts. Okay, now the floor is open to everyone under 35. Patricia will be the judge to decide who has spoken the best of all from the floor, and as a small reward, we'll give you a copy of a book. So now, everybody who speaks, please say who you are and make your point very short and very sharp. Thank you.
So my name is Anjali Gupta. I'm a master's from JNU, and I will be presenting today. My question is that other than treating European narrative as infallible, there is one more Asian tendency which is common among all the Asian countries, which is treating outsiders or the outer narratives as godly and infallible, and treating our own own neighbors as enemies. So what is the real challenge? Is it forming a global-based knowledge of with Asian characteristics, or is it fighting, making friends with our own community? Thank you.
Remember, there won't be time to reply to all questions, but your question in itself is an answer in a fashion. Okay, others, please. Anyone else? I thought young people would be interested in putting their views. Come along. Nobody? Or?
There's one down.
Ah,
I'm sorry, I'm not under 35. That's why I was hesitating.
carry on. We'll treat you as 35.
So, since I'm teaching language, Chinese language, so it's on. Sorry. So, since I'm teaching Chinese language, the point that
Name?
language and discipline. My name is Usha. I'm teaching Chinese language in School of Languages in China in JNU. Center for Chinese Southeast Asian Studies. So my point was about the language and the connection between language and discipline. So I am still wondering that if we do have, it's a thought that if we do have compulsory that students should learn the language before or during their discipline study. What my experience has been that since till the MA second year, we are like still teaching them to be able to translate, something which is a journalistic piece. And then when we jump from journalistic to theoretical or academic writings by the Chinese, we still struggle after 5 years of learning Chinese. So I don't know how to, bridge that gap and actually make China studies more effective with language learning.
Thank you very much. Okay, 35 rule is waived. Yes, sir. Wonderful. This is your 20th anniversary of your 35th year, right?
20th anniversary of my 38th. Yeah. Thank you. So, sir, I have heard about several times speakers talk about Professor Tan Chung, and in the context of Indian perspective of Chinese studies. One book, actually, since the book came out, it is, I felt pain when I saw the name of the book, Elephant and Dragon, and they are dancing tango, and tango is not an Indian at all, and in the beginning this tango and elephant and dragon and elephant, and they are dancing always, and everybody is writing.
But Devashish, why should you take issue with Tan Chung's imagination?
No, I'm thankful. I'm not, with my due respect to him, I'm saying this. This is a small note. I felt pain that even in our selecting, in a lighter mood I'm saying, but in a very critical position I'm taking, that when we say something in our title of a book, we should be very careful. And so this is my polite submission.
Point made. There was somebody else here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I am Tilak. I am currently teaching media at Bennett University. My question is basically that I think that arguments have been made about India-China relations. So civilizational perspective is fine. I mean, civilization perspective can guide the current relation, but at the same time, I don't think any possibility of the current realities can be completely ignored when you consider bilateral ties. They do influence it significantly.
She didn't say that.
So while that can be a lesson, the past can be a lesson, the contemporary realities possibly pose significant challenge. And another thing is that possibly that the impression, and not just possibly impression, I deal with media. So working on Chinese media, my PhD is on Chinese media. I worked for the BBC for a couple of years on Chinese media. So the impression and possibly the reality as well that the country is closed. And I think one of the logic arguments that was made in the first session today, that you can talk everything but politics in China. So these couple of things sort of pose substantial issues as far as improving ties and the interest in China per se is concerned.
I would say that you should come and speak at one of the Wednesday seminars of the ICS. No, it's both a punishment and a reward. But Ashok, I think this can perhaps be considered. Any other comment, question? Yes, sir. एक सेकंड माइक आ रहा है.
So
Which
as far
university in
as
Rajasthan, sir?
Amity University, Rajasthan, I'm teaching Chinese, assistant
Amity.
professor of Chinese. I did masters in Chinese from JNU. Actually, as far as expertise in Chinese studies and language is concerned, so I would like to say, like, I have studied Chinese is one of the toughest language in the world. By the time one get expertise in masters and PhD in language, then is left with very less energy to just study about the other aspects. And the person who has just studied Chinese, studies PhD, I think it's not literally possible to have expertise in a language as well. So this is a bit of this, because in DU we are teaching 2 years Chinese, basic Chinese, and that basic Chinese is not sufficient to do research from Chinese sources. That is very important aspect. So we have to think on this aspect. Another aspect which I would like to come in light, that is the requirement, our social requirement. We are teaching Chinese in JNU, DU, everywhere. We are most of the time teaching history. We are most of the time teaching literature, but we are not looking after our social requirement. Our social requirement is our defense forces are there. Their requirement is there. Then there are interpreters, translators, guides. They are not taught, not trained in the institution. They learn the knowledge from their colleagues and work on the ground. So that gap is to be fulfilled. So such type of courses to be planned at this prime institution so that we can fulfill the requirement of our society. Thank you, sir.
Professor Saab, every single expert on China around the world speaks Chinese. Every single. If you do not speak Chinese, forget about Chinese, Arabic. If you are going to study Arab affairs and you don't speak Arabic, you are a prisoner of English. Is this how you want to carry out your scholarship? I'm sorry, I don't buy that argument, but it's up to all of you to judge. Any other comment? Yes, please. No, we abandoned the 35 rule. Yes, we had to. Everybody was silent.
So I'm a doctoral student at Department of East Asian Studies, and it's a general comment that I've observed at these conferences. We point out the problems that we face, but answers are always lacking. We don't have answers to problems. The discipline versus language problem or the policy versus studies group. We don't have answers.
My sister, we'll all go through life and we don't have answers.
But
You know what Confucius said? He said, not know life, how know, what was the other one? You fill the blank. He was asked a question about something. Sorry? That's right. Exactly. He said, not know life, how know death. Simple. You have to search. Any other comment? Yes, please.
Sir, on India's language problem, my name is Rustam Ali Sirat, PhD scholar at South Asian University. I'm from Afghanistan. On India's language problem, when I came to India and when I got to know that, for very long time India's official language was Persian, but I was surprised that how many less people knew Persian, except some people in JNU, and that's all. I mean, how India can understand its own history if it doesn't, if there are very less people to know Persian. An example that, I was went to Taj Mahal, and the guide, he was telling us that, showing some of this Persian poem, and he was calling that they are Quranic verses, which they were not. So he was making mistake between Arabic and Persian. The thing is that another thing, in Afghanistan, we have radios which are operated from France and from Germany, from BBC is there, and also we have Chinese radios, which they are speaking in Pashto and Persian. There is Chinese who speak in Persian and Pashto, they run their programs. But we don't have any radio from India. So if it was not for Kaswati Zindagi or some other TV series, we would never got to know a lot about India, and that's all. Thank you, sir.
I hope that is a reply to the professor from Amity in Rajasthan. Any other? Yes, please. Another under 35. Sorry. A little louder.
Okay. I retired from the University of Delhi East Asian Studies Department. Professor Srimati was a colleague, and Professor Monty taught me. this is on the issue of the language and the discipline. I did my MA economics, then I got interested in Japan. When I started working for my PhD, it was on a peasant diary which was written in Japanese language, and he had maintained it from 1910 onwards. Continuously for about 70 to 75 years, he had written, continuously. So that was of great interest to me because I was working on pre-war Japanese agriculture. I'm talking about the practical issue. How do you strike a balance between the discipline and the language? I think it is possible despite some of the points that have been raised. Now, it does consume a whole lot of your energy. I had an economics background. I'd done enough studies of the English language material on Japanese agriculture. I literally exhausted everything that was available. Now, after landing in Japan, taking more training in Japanese language, and sitting down and doing the diary was not a joke. I mean, it took me 10 years. So for the sake of academic completion, I did PhD on some other topic on education. But this was a continuing interest, and reporting here that I was able to finish it, and I published 3-4 publications on international journals. And it has been immensely difficult, but it is possible. And now I can claim a little familiarity with the discipline as well as the language. I think it's possible. It takes time.
Thank you very much, sir. Somebody here? Yes, please. Name and...
Yes. My name is Mehak, and I represent the China-India Foundation. My question is really an observation, and I was wondering if there are some comments on it. On this whole idea of language, right, and starting that early on from the undergraduate level or even in high schools, one of the things that I've heard in my interviews with people is that there is this perception that the opportunities at the end of this road are limited, that the ecosystem is limited. And I'm wondering what can be done to create a more vibrant ecosystem where the younger students, and not just at universities like DU or JNU where this has been happening for a reasonably long time, but even at the professional institutes that we have, the IIMs and the law institutes, what can we do to make this ecosystem slightly larger and get students more interested in this, see a light at the end of the road in that sense? Just wondering.
Thank you for a very perceptive remark. Any other comment? Yes, please. Here and anyone else? No? Please.
Hello, I am Parimal from Pune's MIT World Peace University. I must congratulate MIT World Peace University. Yes. I must congratulate ICS on completion of 50 years. And I want to put forward my observation and opinion, which might be completely wrong. But I think ICS really is functioning quite well since last 50 years. But even though it's an exemplary journey, no one in India really wants to follow ICS. That the way ICS is conducting China studies, I don't really see any other institute that has come up conducting a region-specific or a country-specific study the way ICS is doing it. And therefore, I think... Bad, that's bad. Yeah, I mean, not for ICS, but for the country.
No.
I mean, we just don't need the China studies. We also need the Pakistan studies. We also need the Japanese studies.
Right.
And in that context, I think ICS is functioning well, but in isolation. So this isolation really, in my opinion, would not do quite well to the Chinese studies in India. Secondly, I think it is a time for ICS to do advocacy and capacity building in India. Advocacy in terms of the issues that has been raised in the panel discussion. There are so many private institutions that are coming up in India. ICS can really convince them to introduce Chinese as a language, Chinese as a study in their academic arenas. And secondly, capacity building of people who are in public policy and more into media. That people really do not have any idea of what is going on in China, and they keep on speaking and writing on China. So I think ICS really can do a great work in these two domains. Thank you.
Thank you. Your comment leads me to an observation. Why don't all of us become ambassadors of promoting both the Chinese language and China studies and studies in relation to other countries? Dr. Mohanty.
Well, I have a complaint to make against ICS. I am a China watcher. I'm trying to deliberately saying watcher from 1995, and I have seen the gang of four interacting with each other. And I have tried to strengthen the gender studies in ICS since 1995. I brought a lot of material, and many people did PhD and all that. But still, they haven't taken up the gender component. And Anand talks about policy. Unless all the components are incorporated, social basis, women constitute 50% of the society. But we are not deliberately, I would say, but we have ignored that issue.
It's all Manu's fault.
It is all his fault.
He tells ICS, don't listen to the other Professor Mohan.
No.
I'm the only one. Okay.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Now here's another under 35.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. So just 3 points from 3 very, very important issues raised. The first, I will go to Anand and his angst about this policy versus study. I think we do have a problem here in the sense that we do find a lot of emphasis being given because in our own, throughout our interactions, what is the policy relevance? Every time you write something, what is the policy relevance, but I think what we are doing is really conflating them unnecessarily because any good scholarly study will have policy implications. So beyond a point, we needn't get too much into that issue. Just carry on our scholarly work and forget about this. The second is really this discipline and language. Again here, and I will relate it to the third question, and that's the brief point, that problems, no solutions. I think maybe we are going through a transition. Maybe our institutional setup is still absolutely unsatisfactory. Our capacity is very, very limited. But at the end of the day, what I've discovered over the last 2.5 decades of teaching is that the important thing is to strike a passion and a light into the hearts of the students. You put that in, nobody is going to get fatigued. They will push themselves to the brink, but they will get this balance between language and all. So till we can actually get the authorities that be to institute the necessary structures, I think as teachers, as scholars, we just need to ignite that passion.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we are more or less at the end of our time. The panel now has a minute or so to make whatever comment or remarks that they wish to. We'll start with Anand, then Manu, Patricia, and finally Srimati.
Well, I think when I began by saying that this is not a popular opinion, I had sort of understood that this is, and you can quite find that. But I think what Professor Acharya mentioned at the end, in fact, if you really want to differentiate or not conflate policy with studies, I think the essence is also going to remain, if you break it down, it's going to be the student-teacher relationship. And I think the agents of change also need to come from the teaching community. Because ultimately, they are the ones, especially when you're in your doctoral studies or in your research area before you graduate, I think that link becomes extremely key. So, yes, I think you need to, it's a constant struggle, but I think we really need to have a new approach on, or even think and reassess on policy versus studies. That's my belief.
I always envied my Japanese colleagues because as soon as they registered, they were invited to avail a Japan Foundation Fellowship and spend 2 years in Japan, in our Delhi University, you see. Whereas the Chinese government did not offer at that time any such thing. And our government, when it had the opportunity, I remember we requested that the 21 fellowships should be raised to 100 fellowships per year. Manishankar Iyer said, no, why only 100, 500? And for 1 week, 100 youth will go to China. That is not what we wanted. So this is my first point. We have to spend more time studying language in a Chinese area. 2 quick points. I think the intellectual questions, which were very challenging. We have to grapple with the stereotypes that we have inherited whether from Max Weber or from the media or from the, big historians and sociologists and anthropologists. We have to re-examine them and evolve our own methodologies, individually, collectively, and internationally. We have now we have a Bandung Spirit Network, India, China, African, Latin American scholars together in this. So how do we break these stereotypes and evolve new and creative theory?
I think you have to realize, she knows, of course, but that everything comes by practice and by doing. And you can't learn all varieties of Chinese for all types of research, all in one person. I mean, that's impossible. But some amount of spoken Chinese for communicating and being there, and the rest, making your students and making yourself read primary sources in your field, whatever they are, and practice makes perfect, and it's hard. You need the dictionary on one side, and you need to have experts to refer to, and that's the only way to do it, by doing it. So whether you concentrate on the newspapers, you've got newspaper Chinese or whatever it is. Second, I must take issue with Debashish about the Dragon Elephant Tango, of which I was the co-editor in a very memorable experience, because he has not read Tan Shung's introduction, where he explains that dragons and elephants are friendly creatures. They're not nasty and vicious and frightening creatures.
And like pandas.
And when it came to his remark on the tango, as the editor of the book, I might say that in that enormous effort, my greatest pleasure was to read everything I could find about the tango, which is one of the most remarkable dances and has the most remarkable social history of all forms of human expression. I have never had a better time than reading about the tango. I wish I could.
Referred to that in Malampuram.
Yes.
Yes, in defense of the Institute of Chinese Studies, a scholar from Pune said that it's not making much of a contribution. Just a couple of points. In 2006, after we had the first conference, publication was brought out by Professor Madhavi Thampi, and it was sent to the MEA. From there, it was sent to the MHRD. And to the best of my knowledge, it did make an impact, because within a couple of years of that, 8 Chinese language centers were set up by UGC all over the country. And the second point I want to make is that through these All India China Studies conferences, which we hold all over the country, and I mentioned the names of the places where we had it earlier, and next year we are having it in IIT Madras, we are disseminating China studies, and we are getting a very good response. In ICS, we welcome interns from universities, and they come and, and we encourage them to learn the language. Some of them have gone to China and learned the language. So there is some contribution we are making, but of course, a lot needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think in something like 53 minutes, we've covered a fairly broad range of issues, and something like 15 plus people have spoken. I will just say my 2 minutes worth to make a big point, which is that for all its achievements, like any organization, the Institute of Chinese Studies also needs to be self-critical. I've been known in the Institute before they threw me out as a person who speaks his mind. I think the Institute should be, like many Indian institutions, so it's not unique at all to ICS, it should be more open, it should be better connected, and it should be consciously more self-critical. Any organization that can pass this kind of a test, open, connected, and self-critical, will do great stuff. 50 years are wonderful. The next 50 years will be better. Patricia, to whom goes this little book?
Well, I had mixed ideas on this. I first of all appreciate everything from round the table, under 35 or over 35. We'll forgive that. I think that Tilak's point about the civilizational perspective, I would say that we can't just use those terms anymore. We have to be self-critical and decide what we mean by those. So I would like to give this to the young man from South Asia University, Sirif, because when I started this work on this on the learned societies, I started with two quotations. One was from the quotation of the founding articles of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, the first Asiatic society of the English-speaking world. And it said that what we have in mind is everything that pertains to man and nature in the East. That meant not only India, but all beyond, a very encompassing view. And the other one I had was the opposite from our founder figure, Giri Deshankar. Indians have never shown any interest in any country and civilization but their own. And between these two, there is a mile of difference. I think he has invited people to think that there are many other languages and civilizations in this region, and we need to look at them as well, and as he said. And that comes when we found that the courts have just the Indian courts, or a proposal is out to the Indian courts to, outlaw Urdu and Persian as languages used in the language of the court, and so we could have Sanskritized Hindi instead, perhaps. Sanskrit instead. So congratulations to your point, and wish you a very good career. And I hope you're under 35, but it doesn't matter.
Thank you. Thank you. This session is closed. Thank you.